A lynx spent 30 days watching cats. What happened next was something no one expected. What made a wild forest predator stare motionlessly at ordinary domestic cats for 30 days in a row, from dawn to dusk? The answer to this question turned out to be scarier than anyone in the sleepy village of Sosnovka could have imagined. It all started on the hottest day of July. The air was melting, turning the asphalt into sticky tar and the dry grass into dust. Far to the north, dozens of kilometers away, peat bogs had been smoldering for a week. The wind carried a faint, barely perceptible smell of burning, but the summer residents, accustomed to the summer smoke, merely waved it away lazily. They did not yet know that this smoke had brought a guest to their homes, a hungry, desperate, and incredibly intelligent guest. A shadow froze on the rocky ledge overlooking the village. Its spotted fur blended perfectly with the gray stone and the play of sunlight. Only its ears, with black tufts at the tips, twitched nervously, catching every sound. A young lynx, a female, 2 years old, looked down. Her yellow, unblinking predator's eyes scanned the territory. She saw everything. She saw the huge gray cat bars, the master of this land, lazily patrolling his domain, chasing the young upstart Rizhik away from the bowl of milk. She saw a small 3-colored cat named Mirka slip out from under the terrace of an abandoned house that looked like a dinosaur skeleton. She looked around with such alarm, as if death awaited her behind every bush, and quickly disappeared into the tall grass. The lynx knew what such alarm meant. There was someone else there, under the house, small, defenseless, and very vulnerable. The predator's stomach cramped with hunger. She hadn't eaten anything for 3 days. The fire and the larger predators fleeing from it had cleared her hunting grounds. The hares were gone. The birds had flown away. Only these strange creatures remained. Cats, so similar to her, but lacking their wild caution. Easy prey. But something stopped her. The smell of humans. It was everywhere. Sharp, chemical, dangerous. She had to understand their rhythm, their habits. She had to wait. And so she began her long, 30-day observation. Before we continue, let us know which city you are from. We are interested in knowing where our videos are being watched. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your rating. This motivates us to make new and interesting videos. Well, let's begin. Ivan Petrovich Zakharov, a former gamekeeper, sensed something was wrong on the second day. He didn't see anything specific. The forest just fell silent. The birds, which usually sang at dawn, fell silent. The squirrels that stole nuts from his hazel tree disappeared somewhere. In the morning, on his way to the river, he noticed a broken branch on the damp ground by the path. The break was fresh, and something very heavy had stepped on it, but it wasn't a human. A dog? No, there were no paw prints. It was as if an animal had stepped so carefully that it left no traces. Ivan Petrovich crouched down and touched the damp wood with his fingers. His gray eyebrows knitted together on his forehead. It was a feeling familiar to him from his youth. The feeling of someone else's presence. Large, silent, and very dangerous. Returning to the village, he found his neighbor, Stepan Vorobyov, at his chicken coop. Stepan, a stout man with a perpetually worried expression, was shaking his fist in the direction of the forest. "Again, Petrovich, again!" he shouted when he saw his neighbor. "It's a weasel, no doubt. It took one of my hens. I'll set traps for it and break all its legs, that parasite." Ivan Petrovich looked silently at the hole in the net. Torn edges, a tuft of red fur. The work of a fox, not a ferret. But it was useless to argue with Stepan. "Be careful, Stepan," he said quietly. Lock up the animals at night. All of them. And your cat too. Stepan snorted. My Vasya never goes further than the porch, and I lock up the chickens anyway. You'd better tell me what's going on in the forest. It's dead quiet. Ivan Petrovich looked at the rocky ledge towering above the trees. That's what I'm talking about, he said. Dead silence. It's always a sign of something bad. He didn't yet know how bad. He just felt an invisible spring slowly tightening over their peaceful country life. And somewhere up there, cold, hungry eyes were watching them. On the 5th day, the invisible presence began to affect the cat kingdom. Bars, whose power had previously been unchallenged, became nervous and angry. He could sense it, a foreign scent on the border of his territory. Not the scent of a cat, a dog, or a fox. The smell of a real, large predator. It drove him crazy. He couldn't find the source, couldn't challenge it, and he took out his rage on his subjects. Redhead was the first to suffer. The young cat, due to his age and stupidity, decided that the general nervousness was his chance. He demonstratively approached the bowl from which Bars had just eaten and stuck his insolent ginger muzzle into it. The reaction was instantaneous. Bars did not growl or hiss. He struck silently. One blow with his heavy paw, claws extended, tore Rizik's ear. The second knocked him off his feet. Rizik, squealing in pain and humiliation, rolled across the grass and, tucking his tail between his legs, ran away. He ran without looking where he was going, toward the edge of the village, toward the forest, where he hoped to hide and lick his wounds. Meanwhile, the lynx above changed position for the first time in several days. Her hunger became unbearable. She had seen the cats fighting. She had seen the weakness of one and the strength of the other. She understood who was the leader here, and she understood that attacking him would be suicide. But this ginger one, he was young, stupid, and now wounded. The perfect target. She began her descent. Her paws padded silently over the stones. Her body moved smoothly, like water. Below, at the edge of the forest, the beaten redhead sat licking his bleeding ear. He was so absorbed in his grief that he did not hear the bushes rustle behind him. The lynx was already preparing to pounce. Her muscles tensed. Another second, and it would all be over. But at that moment, Ivan Petrovich, who had come out onto his porch, coughed loudly. The sharp, unexpected sound made the lynx freeze, and Rizik, hearing the familiar cough, raised his head. Their eyes met. The cat did not see a beast. He saw death. A huge spotted shadow crouched on the ground, and 2 yellow eyes glowed in the semi-darkness. The primitive fear that lay dormant in every domestic animal awoke. Rizik let out such a wild, heart-rending cry that had never been heard before in Sosnovka. And he ran. He raced through the vegetable gardens, knocking down greenhouses and getting tangled in cucumber nets, screaming incessantly. The lynx, realizing that the element of surprise had been lost, silently disappeared into the forest. And Ivan Petrovich found what he was looking for. By the stream, in the place where he had noticed the broken branch last time, there was a footprint in the soft mud. A perfect, clear footprint, round, without claws. He knelt down. There was no doubt. It was a lynx. From that evening on, life in the village was divided into before and after. Rizik's story about the eyed monster with tassels on its ears spread throughout the cat community. Of course, no one believed him, but his animal fear was contagious. The cats stopped going out at night. Even the bold teenagers huddled close to their homes. Bars patrolled the area with redoubled ferocity, but did not stray far from the center of the village. Only Mirka, under the abandoned house, had not heard the news. Her world had shrunk to the size of the dark, dusty space under the terrace. Her kittens had grown up and started to scatter, and she was spending all her energy trying to keep them together. Ivan Petrovich, realizing the scale of the threat, went to see his neighbors. First, he went to Stepan. "Stepan, it's not a ferret or a fox," he said firmly. "We have a lynx in the forest. I saw the tracks. We need to call the forestry office and warn people." Stepan looked at him as if he were crazy. "Petrovich, have you been eating too many mushrooms? What lynx? They haven't been seen here for 100 years. It's all foxes, I tell you. Cunning, damn it." The other neighbors reacted the same way. They laughed and tapped their fingers on their temples. It was summer, it was hot, and the old man was losing his mind. Ivan Petrovich realized that he was alone. Alone with a predator that no one could see and with people who didn't want to see the obvious. He decided to take matters into his own hands. Every evening, he walked around the edge of the village, carefully examining the ground, trying to predict where the beast might strike. He knew that hunger would sooner or later force the lynx to cross the line. And he was wrong by just one day. On the 10th night, the lynx came down from the ledge again. But this time, its target was not cats. It was led by the smell of fish guts that Rizik's mistress had thrown into the trash can in the evening. For humans, it was garbage. For a hungry predator, it was a feast. It moved like a ghost. Not a single dog barked. Not a single board creaked. It approached the bin, easily knocked it over with its powerful paw, grabbed the bag of waste, and disappeared just as silently. In the morning, there was a commotion. "Stray dogs!" Rizik's owner exclaimed indignantly. "They've taken all the trash." But when Ivan Petrovich approached the scene, he saw what the others had missed. Next to the dog's paw prints on the dusty ground were faint scratches. Deep, parallel scratches from the claws that the beast had extended to keep its balance. A dog doesn't scratch like that. The predator had crossed the line. It was no longer in the forest. It was among them. With each passing day, the lynx grew bolder. It realized that at night, the human world was blind and deaf. It learned the route of the only guard who patrolled the village on his old motorcycle at midnight sharp. It knew which houses had dogs and which did not. Its hunting grounds now included the outskirts of Sosnovka. One night, she dragged a rabbit out of a cage that Stepan, in his carelessness, had forgotten to lock. In the morning, the neighbors' cries could be heard throughout the neighborhood. "I told you, a wild animal," he yelled, shaking the empty cage. "It's all your lynx's fault, Petrovich. We've been waiting for this." Panic slowly spread through the village. People began to lock their gates and keep their children away from the forest. But no one still believed in a lynx. They thought it was a fox or feral dogs. Stepan, convinced he was right, took his old hunting rifle, which had belonged to his father, from the attic. It was a 16-gauge double-barreled shotgun. He cleaned it, oiled it, and loaded it with large caliber shot. Every evening, he sat down in a chair on his porch, placed the gun beside him, and waited. He was going to defend his property. The lynx, having eaten the rabbit, had only temporarily satisfied its hunger. This meal was too little for her large body, and her gaze increasingly lingered on the abandoned house. She saw small, squeaking balls running out from under the terrace. Mirka's kittens. They had already grown up and begun to play, rolling out onto the grass under their mother's watchful eye. They were perfect prey. Easy, defenseless. The lynx began to plan. She noticed that the mother cat always went hunting at dusk, when the heat subsided. She left her kittens alone for literally half an hour. That would be enough time. All she had to do was wait for the right moment. And that moment came on the 20th day. Dusk was falling over the village. Mirka, as usual, slipped out from under the house. Her kittens, full and sleepy, huddled together in the far corner. She looked around nervously. The anxiety that had haunted her all these weeks was particularly strong today. But hunger was stronger. She had to find something for herself so she would have milk. She slipped silently toward Ivan Petrovich's house, where she was sometimes fed. At that very moment, the lynx began its descent. It moved slowly, blending into the thickening shadows. Each step was calculated. She knew she only had a few minutes. Stepan sat on the porch of the neighboring house like a sentry, his rifle on his knees. He stared blankly into the darkness, listening to the sounds of the night. Suddenly, one of the kittens, the most curious one with a white spot on its nose, woke up. It saw a moth hovering over a flower and, forgetting everything, rolled out from under the porch into the open space. The lynx froze. Its prey was walking right into its paws. She crouched down, preparing for the final, decisive leap. 10 meters, 5. The tiny body was already so close. Suddenly, a light came on the porch of the house opposite. Ivan Petrovich came out into the street. He didn't see the lynx, but his sixth sense as a gamekeeper screamed danger. He just stood there and stared at the abandoned house, as if sensing something. His motionless figure in the strip of light became an insurmountable obstacle. The lynx froze in the shadows of the bushes. She couldn't attack in front of a human. It was too risky. She waited. The seconds dragged on like hours. The kitten, having lost interest in the butterfly, turned around and clumsily hobbled back to the house. At that moment, Mirka returned. She saw her child in the open, saw the frozen figure of Ivan Petrovich, and felt the icy breath of death in the air. She let out a hollow, furious growl, grabbed the kitten by the scruff of its neck, and dragged it under the house. The lynx realized that the moment had passed. Hungry and angry, she retreated back into the safety of the forest. Ivan Petrovich watched her go. At the last moment, as the animal turned, the moonlight glinted off its spotted side. Now he had more than just a hunch. He was certain. He had seen her, and he knew that he couldn't wait until the next night. Tragedy was inevitable. The next day, Ivan Petrovich made one last attempt. He didn't go to Stepan. He called the district center, the hunting supervision service. He calmly and clearly explained the situation. A lynx had appeared in the cottage village, was behaving unusually, coming close to the houses and posing a threat. On the other end of the line, he was listened to with bored indifference. "Your report has been taken," replied a sleepy voice. "An inspector will come when he gets to your area. Maybe in a week." "In a week it may be too late." Ivan Petrovich raised his voice. "The animal is hungry. It will attack." "Sir, don't get so worked up," the voice replied lazily. "We've got fires all over the district. Everyone's out there. Your lynx is probably just a big cat. Wait for the inspector." He hung up. Ivan Petrovich clenched the phone in his hand until his knuckles hurt. He was alone. The system he had hoped would help him had turned its back on him. His neighbors thought he was crazy. And the beast was here, nearby, growing more desperate. He realized that now the responsibility was all his. That evening, he took his rifle out of an old safe. Not to shoot, to be ready. He knew he couldn't kill the beast. It was listed in the Red Book. But he could scare it away with a shot in the air if necessary. Meanwhile, the weather began to change dramatically. The wind, which had barely stirred the leaves before, picked up. It drove a thick, suffocating veil of smoke from the north. The sky on the horizon turned crimson. It became difficult to breathe. The summer residents became alarmed and began calling each other. Rumors spread that the fire had crossed the river and was heading straight for them. The lynx on its ledge also sensed the change. The smell of burning became unbearably strong. Instincts honed by thousands of years of evolution told her to run. But where? Behind her, to the north, the flames raged. The only way to safety, to the river and the untouched forests on the other side, was through the village, through human territory. It was a deadly risk. But staying here meant certain death in the fire. She looked down at the burning houses, the frantic people, the panicking animals. Her hunter's dilemma was replaced by that of a fugitive. And she made her decision. As soon as darkness finally hit her, she would make her final dash. A dash for life. And no one could predict what it would mean for the small village. The panic came not with a scream, but with the wind. Hot and dry, it carried with it not just the smell of burning, but small, still smoldering particles of ash. They settled on faces, hair, and rooftops like ominous black snow. And then came the sound. A low, continuous rumble, like the roar of a jet plane that never flies away. It was the forest roaring. Centuries-old pine trees were burning, bursting from the heat like giant firecrackers. The sky in the north was no longer just crimson. It turned orange, and black clouds of smoke swirled in it like a cauldron of hell. The summer residents were the first to break down. Frightened cries began to come from the houses. Someone tried to start an old Neva, but the engine only coughed desperately and stalled. A woman ran around the yard in a panic, trying to catch a parrot that had escaped from its cage. The village of Sosnovka, which had been an island of sleepy summer peace that morning, was turning into an anthill flooded with boiling water. The animals sensed it first. Cats that had been hiding in fear an hour ago now ran out of their hiding places. Their instinct drove them away from the forest, toward the water, toward the saving coolness of the river. The leopard, forgetting his royal status, ran down the main street with the others, turning from a leader into one of many fugitives. Rizhik, who had been hiding under his master's porch, jumped out and impressed himself against the legs of his crying mistress. He was no longer looking for adventure. He was looking for salvation. Stepan sat on his porch, in the epicenter of the chaos. He did not run or scream. His face was pale and his eyes were frozen with a mad, fanatical gleam. He did not see a fire. He saw confirmation of all his fears. The world was collapsing, and in this collapsing world, there had to be someone to blame. And he knew who it was. The beast from the forest. He gripped his rifle tighter. He waited. He knew the beast would come. Ivan Petrovich acted differently. There was no panic in his movements, only a stern habit of dealing with emergency situations honed over many years. He did not start gathering his belongings. He grabbed an axe, a large canvas blanket, and went outside. To the river, he shouted to his neighbors, who were trying to pack barbecues and garden furniture into their cars. You won't get through in your cars. There's only one road. There'll be a traffic jam. Drop everything and go to the river. It's safer there. But no one listened to him. Everyone was saving their own little world, unable to see the bigger picture. He realized he was wasting time. His main concern now was not furniture, but life. The lives of people and the life of a beast cornered. He knew where the lynx would run. It would take the shortest route to the water, away from the fire. And that path lay right across Stepan's property. Ivan Petrovich rushed there, jumping over his fence. He had to make it in time. He had to stop his neighbor before he did something stupid. Meanwhile, a tragedy was unfolding under the old terrace. The space under the house quickly filled with acrid smoke. The kittens squeaked and coughed, poking their blind faces into their mother's belly. Mirka realized that they had no time. Staying here meant suffocating. She made the most difficult decision of her life. She had to lead them out into the open, into the very center of the chaos. She began to push them out, one by one, urging them on with a quiet murmur. The kittens, finding themselves in such a frightening and loud world for the first time, huddled together, trembling with fear. And at that moment, the lynx began to run. The fire had reached the very foot of the ledge. The stones were red hot. She jumped. Her body, designed for silent hunting, was now working in desperate flight mode. She rushed through the bushes, breaking branches, ignoring the scratches. She was no longer a predator. She was prey, fleeing from a predator more terrifying than herself, fire. All paths converged at a single point. On the overgrown lawn in front of Stepan's house, the lynx, mad with fear, leaped over the low fence separating the abandoned lot from the neighbor's yard. It landed on all four paws and froze for a second, blinded by the light of the flashing lanterns and the glare of the fire. It was huge, much larger than people imagined. Its spotted fur bristled and muscles rolled under its skin. A hoarse, frightened breath escaped from its mouth. At that moment, Mirka tried to lead her litter across the same lawn. She pushed the kittens forward, trying to shield them from the terrifying world with her small body. But one, the one with a white spot on its nose, lagged behind. It froze in the middle of the lawn, paralyzed by the roar of the fire, the screams of people, and the sudden appearance of a giant shadow that seemed to have grown out of the ground. It just sat there and stared with its blue kitten eyes at the huge forest cat that was now 5 meters away from it. Stepan saw this from his porch. But he didn't see what was really happening. He didn't see two frightened animals, a mother and her child, and a hunted beast. He saw what he wanted to see. The predator had come for its prey. "You creature!" he shouted, his voice breaking into a scream. "I knew it." He raised his double-barreled shotgun. The heavy butt rested against his shoulder. He caught the spotted silhouette in his sights. He didn't see the kitten. He saw nothing but his target. His finger rested on the trigger. The entire 30-day history of anxiety, fear, and anticipation was about to end now. With one deafening shot, Ivan Petrovich ran as fast as he could. He saw the raised gun, saw the lynx frozen on the lawn, saw the tiny lump at its paws. He was too far away to reach it. It was useless to shout. Stepan, in his madness, would not have hurt anyone. Time stretched out, becoming viscous, like tar. He saw Stepan's back tense, saw him lean forward, ready to fire. The lynx, frozen for a second, began to move again. But it didn't lunge at the kitten. Its gaze was fixed further away, beyond the house, toward the safety of the darkness by the river. The kitten was just a small, insignificant obstacle in its path. It took a powerful leap, not at the kitten, but over it, to the side. Its huge body flew through the air like a spotted lightning bolt. And at that very moment, a shot rang out. Two, in fact. Stepan, without really aiming, pulled both triggers. A double shot. A double load of large buckshot burst from the barrels with a deafening roar and tore through the night. He was aiming at the spot where the lynx had just been, but it was already gone. The shot, intended to stop a bear, passed centimeters from the head of the frightened kitten and knocked down half of an old wooden fence, scattering splinters dozens of meters away. The kitten, stunned and covered in dirt, squeaked and rushed to its mother, who had come running. The lynx, frightened even more by the shot than by the fire, picked up speed. It rushed past the porch where Stepan was standing and disappeared into the darkness. It ran toward the river, toward safety. Stepan remained standing with a smoking, useless rifle in his hands, stunned by his own shot in the center of the village, which with every passing minute looked more and more like hell. He had missed. But he did not yet know that with his miss, he had just set off a chain of events far more terrifying than the attack of a predator. Because the sound of a gunshot in a panicked village, next to a burning forest, had the effect of a bomb going off. "They're shooting," someone shouted. This thought, crazy and illogical, instantly took hold of the crowd. Panic turned into hysteria. People abandoned their homes and rushed to the road, to their cars. A stampede ensued. In the narrow passage between the plots, an old Neva finally started, but immediately crashed into a stalled Moskvich. The road was blocked. Meanwhile, the fire was getting closer. The tops of the pine trees on the edge of the village were already burning, flashing like giant torches. The heat became unbearable. Ivan Petrovich ran up to Stepan and snatched the gun from his hands. "What have you done, you idiot?" he shouted, shaking his neighbor by the shoulders. "You'll kill everyone." But Stepan didn't listen to him. He stared blankly at the broken fence and the people running around, muttering the same thing over and over. "She's gone. The creature. She's gone." He did not yet realize the full horror of his actions. At that moment, sparks began to fly from the roof of Stepan's barn, the building closest to the forest. The dry wood, heated to the limit, began to smolder. First, a small flame appeared, then a second. Half a minute later, the entire roof was engulfed in flames. The fire spread to the human territory. The fire from which everyone was running was no longer in the forest. It was here, among them. And there was nowhere to run from it, except to the river. But the way there lay through burning buildings and a frenzied crowd. Ivan Petrovich realized that they were trapped. And the blame lay not with a wild beast, but with human fear, embodied in a single, thoughtless shot. He looked at the burning barn, at his panicking neighbors, at Stepan, who was frozen in place. The situation had gone from dangerous to deadly. The flames that had started on the roof of the barn behaved like a living, predatory creature. They jumped onto the dry branches of an old apple tree, instantly engulfing it. The tree burst into flames like a match, showering the dry grass below with sparks. Within 10 seconds, Stepan's entire property was a fiery trap. The heat was so intense that the paint on the walls of his house began to bubble and blacken. Then, with a deafening crash, the window on the porch burst open. The fire immediately spread inside, finding new fuel in the old curtains and wooden furniture. The house that Stepan had so desperately defended from an imaginary threat was now being consumed by a real threat, born of his own fear. The cries of people mingled with the roar of the fire. The crowd at the blocked road grew more intense. Someone tried to break down the fence to get to the next street, but in their panic, they only got in each other's way. Ivan Petrovich realized that they only had minutes left. He shook Stepan violently, trying to bring him to his senses. "Stepan, wake up! We have to get out of here!" But his neighbors stared at his burning house with empty, blind eyes. His world had burned to the ground, and he had burned with it. Ivan Petrovich realized that it was too late to save Stepan's mind. He had to save his life. He threw his arm around his neighbor's shoulder and practically dragged him along. "Follow me," he shouted to the woman with the child standing nearby. Through the gardens to the river, It's the only way. He didn't wait for an answer. He just went ahead, away from the road, deeper into the village, where the fire had not yet reached its full force. Several people, seeing his confidence, instinctively followed him. They became a small island of order in an ocean of chaos. Meanwhile, the cats were fighting their own battle for survival. Mirka, clutching the rescued kitten to her chest, desperately tried to gather the others. But the kittens, crazed with fear, scattered in all directions. One hid under a currant bush, another in an empty barrel. The path to the river, where she wanted to lead them, was now cut off by the fire coming from Stepan's house. She rushed between them, trying to gather her small, frightened group, knowing that every second of delay could be the last. Not far from her, by the fence, two former enemies collided, Bars and Rizik. They found themselves on the same path of retreat. On any other day, it would have ended in a fight. But not today. They looked at each other, and there was no hatred in their eyes, only a shared, primal terror. They both understood that alone, they would not survive. With a silent agreement, they joined forces. Bars, who knew the area better, led the way. Rizik, younger and faster, followed him. Their enmity, their struggle for status, all turned to ashes in the face of the roaring flames. Now they had only one goal, common to all living creatures in this hell: to reach the water. They ran, dodging the burning areas, instinctively choosing the safest route that slowly but surely led them to safety. Their path lay through backyards, through abandoned vegetable gardens, through the very area with the old house where Mirka had recently hidden with her offspring. The lynx reached the river first. She flew out of the village like a cannonball and, without hesitation, threw herself into the water. The cold stream cooled her hot fur. She swam to the other side, climbed out onto dry land, shook herself off, and disappeared into the thickets of willow trees. She was safe. Behind her, on the other bank, a fiery spectacle was unfolding. Houses were burning, trees were falling, and the cries of people reached her ears. She was exhausted, frightened, and still hungry. But she had survived. She hid in the bushes, watching the disaster that she had not caused, but found herself at the center of. Her hunting instincts were silent. Only one instinct was at work now: self-preservation. She would lie there until it was all over, until the last person left and the last ember died out. She was no longer a threat. She was just a spectator at the most terrifying spectacle of her life. She did not know that on the other side, in the ring of fire, the fate of not only humans was being decided, but also that of the tiny creatures she had watched for so long, considering them easy prey. Even Petrovich's group moved quickly. The former gamekeeper led them along secret paths known only to him. Through a hole in the fence, along a narrow strip between vegetable gardens, bypassing the most dangerous areas. Behind them, Stepan's house was collapsing. Burning beams fell down with a crash, sending fountains of sparks into the sky. They had almost reached the abandoned plot, beyond which a gentle slope led down to the river. All that remained was to cross the last open space. And then they heard it, a thin, desperate squeak. It came from under the terrace of that very abandoned house. Even Petrovich froze. He saw Mirka. The cat was darting around at the very edge of the terrace, throwing herself at the smoldering boards and immediately jumping back. Her 3 kittens huddled at her feet. The 4th was nowhere to be seen. The squeak came from under the house. Apparently, in a panic, one of the kittens had crawled back into its lair and now couldn't get out, and that den was about to burst into flames. The dry old boards of the terrace were already smoking from the heat of the neighboring fire. Ivan Petrovich looked at the people behind him. They were frightened, waiting for him to save them. He looked at Stepan's lifeless body, which he was still dragging along. Then he looked at the frantic mother cat and heard her desperate squeak. He was a gamekeeper. All his life he had either saved or taken the lives of animals. But he had never been indifferent. And now he was faced with a choice. Continue on his way to safety, saving people, or risk everything, his life, the lives of those who trusted him, for the sake of a tiny, squeaking life trapped in a fiery trap. At that moment, one of the terrace's support beams broke with a loud crack. The entire structure tilted dangerously, ready to collapse at any second and bury the last kitten beneath it. Ivan Petrovich did not hesitate. The decision was made in the split second between thought and action. "Go to the river. Don't wait for me," he shouted to the woman, pushing her in the back. "Along the fence, you can get through there. Quick!" He let go of Stepan, who collapsed to the ground like a sack and rushed toward the burning house. Murka, seeing a man running toward her, jumped back in fear but did not run away. She stayed close by, her eyes full of horror and hope, following his every move. Ivan Petrovich fell to his knees. The heat from the smoldering boards was unbearable. He lay down on his stomach and crawled under the terrace into a narrow, smoke-filled space. The air burned his lungs. Sweat and soot streamed down his face. He could see almost nothing, guided only by the desperate squeaking that was growing louder. The kitten had huddled in the farthest corner, behind an old rotten beam. Ivan Petrovich reached out his hand, but couldn't reach it. Just a few more centimeters. He tried to crawl further, but his shoulders got stuck. There was an ominous crack above him. The structure sagged even lower, and hot coals rained down on his back. The pain burned through his thin shirt. He realized he had only one chance. He had to lure the kitten out. He began to call it quietly, in the same calm voice he had used to call forest animals decades ago. But the kitten, crazed with fear, only squeaked and huddled in its corner. It seemed that all was lost. And then, out of the darkness, two shadows appeared, Bars and Rizik. They jumped out onto the plot, escaping the fire, and froze when they saw the incredible scene. A burning house, Murka darting around the entrance, and a man half hidden under the smoking terrace. Rizik cowered fearfully on the ground. But Bars, an old street fighter, instantly assessed the situation. He did not see a human threat. He saw a living creature trying to save another. He saw a mother cat begging for help. He saw their common enemy, the fire that surrounded them on all sides. Something stirred in his feline soul. He approached the edge of the terrace, peered into the dark opening, and let out a short, commanding meow. It was not a cry of threat. It was a call, a language understood by all cats. The kitten under the house heard the leader's voice. It fell silent for a second, then staggered toward the sound. It crawled out from behind the beam and found itself right in front of Ivan Petrovich's hand. The old man didn't hesitate. He grabbed the soft bundle, tucked it under his shirt, and crawled back with all his strength. He rolled out from under the porch just before the entire structure collapsed with a deafening crash, burying everything inside. A huge column of sparks and smoke shot into the sky. Ivan Petrovich lay on the ground, coughing and trying to catch his breath. He unbuttoned his shirt. A live, trembling kitten poked its head out and squeaked. Murka immediately jumped up to him, grabbed it by the scruff of its neck, and dragged it away to the rest of her children, hiding them under a large burdock bush. Ivan Petrovich slowly got to his feet. His back was burning, his head was spinning from the smoke, but he was unharmed, and the kitten was saved. He looked at Bars. The cat stood a few meters away, and looked at him with his intelligent, serious eyes. There was no fear in their gaze. There was something like recognition, understanding. Then Bars turned, waved his tail at Rizik, and they disappeared together into the shadows, continuing on their way to the river. In that brief moment of respite, Ivan Petrovich realized that something incredible had happened. In the face of certain death, all barriers had collapsed, between man and beast, between feuding cats. Only one thing remained, the will to live. But the respite was too short. He turned around. The path he had led his group along was now cut off. The collapsed terrace and the fence that had caught fire from it created a solid wall of fire. On the other side, from Stepan's house, the flames had already spread to the neighboring plot. They found themselves in a fiery bag. On one side were roaring flames, on the other, smoldering ruins. There was no way to the river. The woman with the child, whom he had sent ahead, looked at him in horror. They hadn't made it either. They were all trapped. Hopelessness, cold and clammy, enveloped Ivan Petrovich. He had saved the kitten, but it seemed he had doomed everyone else. And himself too. He sank to the ground next to the frozen Stepan. It was getting harder and harder to breathe. The heat was so intense that it seemed as if the air itself was melting. "It's over," whispered the woman. "This is the end." And in that deafening silence of despair, something happened that no one could have expected. Stepan, who had been a living corpse all this time, suddenly stirred. He slowly raised his head, his empty eyes focused on the ruins of the abandoned house, then on the burning fence, then on Ivan Petrovich. He saw the kitten scurrying around the bush, saved by his neighbor Murka. He saw the soot and burns on the old man's back. Something in his mind, destroyed by fear and guilt, clicked. He looked at the little rescued kitten, the one that had been in the line of his shot. He was saved. And now they were all going to die. His lips moved. At first they were silent. Then a hoarse, cracked sound escaped from his throat. He stretched out his trembling hand, not toward the river, but in the opposite direction, pointing to an old, weed-covered hill in the corner of the lot, where the crooked stone foundation of a long-demolished building stood. And he uttered a single word, which sounded like a shot of hope in the fiery roar. "Cellar." Ivan Petrovich looked where Stepan was pointing. A cellar, an old pre-war cellar, built of rough stone. He had almost forgotten it existed. The entrance, overgrown with nettles and burdocks, was almost invisible. The heavy wooden door, covered with rusty iron, looked as if it hadn't been opened in 50 years. It was a chance. Crazy, desperate, but the only one. "There, quick," he commanded. He hoisted the limp Stepan onto his shoulders again, who, pointing the way to safety, fell back into a stupor. The woman grabbed her child. They rushed toward the old foundation. Fire was approaching from all sides. Burning embers were already falling a few meters away from them. The door to the cellar was locked with a huge padlock. Rust had eaten away almost all of it, but it was still holding. "An axe," Ivan Petrovich shouted. He remembered that he was still clutching the axe handle in his hand. He struck once, then again. The rusty metal gave way. The lock broke with a nasty screech. He leaned his shoulder against the door. The old wood creaked, but did not open. Something was holding it from the inside. He and the woman leaned against it together. The door gave way a few inches, and the smell of dampness, mold, and cold earth hit their faces. It was the smell of life. Gathering their last strength, they pulled the door toward them. It creaked open, revealing a dark, downward-sloping passage. the woman with the child, went down first. Then Ivan Petrovich, almost throwing Stepan down, began to climb down himself. He was already halfway inside when his gaze fell on a bush of burdock under which cats were huddling. Mirka was looking straight at him. There was no fear in her eyes. There was only a silent plea. She couldn't take the kittens away. They were too small to jump over the high threshold of the cellar, and she wouldn't abandon them. Damn. Ivan Petrovich exhaled. He couldn't leave them, not after everything that had happened. He jumped out of the cellar back into the fiery hell. "What are you doing?" the woman shouted from the darkness. But he didn't listen to her. He ran to the bush and grabbed Mirka and the kittens in his arms. The cat didn't resist. She understood. She just purred softly, trying to calm her trembling offspring. He rushed back to the hole in the ground that would save them. At that moment, the roof of the abandoned house, which had burned to the ground, collapsed with a deafening crash. A fiery whirlwind, a wave of hot air and ash, hit him in the back, knocking him off his feet. He fell, dropping the cats, and rolled straight toward the entrance to the cellar. The last thing he saw before sinking into darkness was Mirka pushing her kittens aside, one by one, and pushing them down into the safety of the darkness, then jumping herself. The heavy door, torn off its hinges, slammed shut over their heads under the force of the fire, plunging the world into absolute darkness and silence. They were trapped. But it was a trap that saved their lives. Outside, the fire raged and the world collapsed. And down below, in a cold stone sack, holding their breath, sat a man, a woman, a child, a madman, and a family of cats. United by one catastrophe. Saved by a chain of incredible coincidences that began 30 days ago with the cold, hungry gaze of a forest lynx. They did not know how long they had been down there. An hour, 2, an eternity. The sounds outside gradually faded away. The roar of the fire was replaced by the crackling of cooling embers. They sat in complete silence, broken only by the quiet crying of the child and the rhythmic purring of Mirka, who was feeding her rescued kittens. Stepan was the first to wake up. He sat up, wrapped his arms around his head, and cried quietly, without a sound. These were not tears of fear or despair. They were tears of belated, bitter realization. He understood everything. He understood that he had been chasing a ghost while his real enemy burned his home. He realized that the old man he had thought was crazy had risked his life to save him, a madman, and a little kitten. His whole life, all his fears and beliefs, had turned to ashes up there. Ivan Petrovich found an old lighter in his pocket. He flicked it once, then twice. A small flame lit up their soot-covered faces and frightened eyes. They looked like primitive people hiding in a cave from the raging elements. When the light went out, the woman asked quietly, "What now?" Ivan Petrovich paused, then replied calmly, "Now we will live." In the morning, when the air in the cellar became completely stale, they decided to go out. Ivan Petrovich struggled to push the door open. It was not heat that hit their faces, but the smell of burning and damp earth. They made their way outside. Almost nothing remained of the village of Sosnovka. Black, smoking ruins of houses stood against the backdrop of an equally black, dead forest. Everything was covered with a layer of gray ash. It was a picture of complete, apocalyptic destruction. But in the east, above the scorched earth, the sun was rising. And the river, which they had never reached, sparkled in its rays, clean and unharmed. Their small group of survivors stood in the middle of this wasteland. Mirka sat next to them, licking her kittens. A little further away, on a surviving fence post, sat Bars and Rizik. They had also survived. They looked at the people without fear. The boundaries had been erased. In this new, scorched world, they were all just living beings who had survived the same catastrophe. Ivan Petrovich looked toward the other bank. There, in the morning haze, he thought he saw a familiar spotted silhouette for a moment. A lynx. She stood and looked at them. Their eyes met from a distance. There was no longer any hunger in her eyes. There was only calmness. She turned and silently disappeared into the surviving forest. Her long observation was over. She was leaving to find a new territory, a new life, far away from people who had turned out to be more frightening and unpredictable than any forest predator. Ivan Petrovich, Stepan, and the others looked at the ruins of their former lives, realizing that for 30 days they had been waiting for a threat from the wrong direction. They had feared a beast from the forest, but the real disaster had been born of their own fear, panic, and a single shot fired into the darkness. Who do you think was the main cause of the disaster in Sosnovka? The lynx that provoked fear, or Stepan, who gave in to that fear and started shooting?